My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, leaving me with nothing but unpaid medical bills and the bitter taste of 28 years of disappointment. What I discovered 3 months later would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family, and change my life in ways I never imagined possible. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The funeral was small. Pathetically small, actually. Just me, my father's gambling buddy Eddie, and Mrs. Chen from the corner store who always let Dad buy cigarettes on credit. The pastor stumbled through a generic eulogy about a man he'd never met, while I sat in the front pew wearing a suit I'd borrowed from my roommate. Wondering how I was going to pay for the cremation. Richard Blake had been many things in his 56 years, a disappointment, a drunk, a dreamer who never quite managed to catch his dreams. What he hadn't been was a provider. Growing up, I'd watched him bounce between construction jobs, sales gigs, and get-rich-quick schemes that invariably left us broker than before. My mother had left when I was 12, taking my younger sister Emma with her. I can't watch him destroy himself anymore, she'd told me before loading their suitcases into her beat-up Honda. And I won't let him destroy Emma too. I'd stayed. Partly out of loyalty, mostly out of stubbornness. Someone had to keep an eye on the old man, make sure he didn't drink himself to death or gamble away the security deposit on whatever crummy apartment we were calling home that month. For 16 years, I'd been his keeper, his conscience, his constant reminder that actions have consequences. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now facing the ultimate consequence of his actions. Debt. The hospital bills alone totaled $47,000. Add in the funeral costs, his unpaid rent, and the money he owed to Eddie's less-than-reputable loan shark friends, and I was looking at a mountain of obligations that made my community college salary as an auto mechanic instructor look like pocket change. I was sitting in my studio apartment that Friday evening, staring at a stack of bills and nursing a beer that tasted like defeat, when someone knocked on my door. It was past 9 o'clock, and the only people who visited me were bill collectors and Eddie looking for Dad's imaginary stash of gambling winnings. The man standing in my hallway wasn't either. He was tall, maybe 60, with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Everything about him screamed expensive, from his Italian leather shoes to the gold watch that caught the light from my flickering hallway bulb. Marcus Blake? His voice carried the kind of authority that made you stand straighter without thinking about it. Yeah, that's me. Look, if you're here about my father's debts, I'm not. He extended a business card with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Theodore Whitman, senior partner at Whitman, Sterling and Associates. I represent your grandfather's estate. I took the card, studying the embossed lettering. The firm's address was in the financial district, the kind of place where parking cost more per hour than I made in a day. My grandfather? Richard's father died when I was 5. Some heart attack in Florida. Whitman's expression didn't change. I'm referring to William Montgomery Blake, your paternal grandfather. He passed away 14 months ago. The name meant nothing to me. I think you've got the wrong guy. My grandfather was Frank Blake, and like I said, he died years ago. May I come in? This conversation requires some privacy. Something in his tone made me step aside. My apartment wasn't much, a converted studio above a laundromat with walls thin enough to hear my neighbor's television through the drywall, but Whitman settled into my second-hand armchair like he was visiting an old friend. Your father never told you about William Montgomery Blake, he said. It wasn't a question. Should he have? Whitman reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. William Blake was one of the most successful defense contractors in the country. His company, Blake Advanced Systems, held contracts with the Pentagon for over 3 decades. When he died, his estate was valued at approximately $230 million. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Right. And I'm secretly the Prince of England. Look, Mr. Whitman, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but your father was disinherited in 1987. Whitman's words cut through my laughter like a blade. He was 21 years old, fresh out of college, and he made some choices that William found unacceptable. Your grandfather was a man of rigid principles, Mr. Blake. When Richard chose to marry your mother against his wishes, when he refused to join the family business, when he publicly criticized William's government contracts. Well, William Blake was not a forgiving man. The pieces started clicking together in my head. Dad's occasional bitter comments about rich bastards who think money makes them gods. His refusal to talk about his childhood, the way he'd change the subject whenever I asked about grandparents. I'd always assumed we came from nothing because that's all I'd ever known. So you're saying my grandfather was loaded, cut my dad off, and now you're here because, what, he feels bad about it from beyond the grave? Not exactly. Whitman opened the folder and pulled out a document that looked like it had been drafted by a small army of lawyers. William Blake died without ever reconciling with your father. However, he did establish something called a contingency trust in 1994. Are you familiar with that term? I shook my head. A contingency trust is activated under specific circumstances. In this case, the trust was designed to become active upon your father's death, provided you met certain criteria established by your grandfather. My mouth felt dry. What kind of criteria? You had to be William's direct male descendant. You had to be over 25 years old. You had to have no criminal record. And most importantly, you had to have received no financial support from William Blake during your lifetime. Whitman's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. Your father's disinheritance, it turns out, was the key to your inheritance. The room started spinning a little. I set down my beer before I dropped it. How much are we talking about? The trust currently holds $53 million. The words hung in the air like smoke. $53 million. I'd spent my entire life counting pennies, choosing between groceries and gas money, wearing second-hand clothes and driving cars held together with prayer and duct tape. $53 million was more money than I could even conceptualize. There's something else, Whitman continued, seemingly oblivious to my existential crisis. The trust comes with conditions. Significant ones. Of course it did. Nothing in my family came without strings attached. What kind of conditions? Your grandfather called it his black budget trust. The money comes from contracts that were, shall we say, not entirely transparent to public oversight. William Blake built his fortune on projects the government preferred to keep quiet. Defense technologies, surveillance systems, weapons development that officially never existed. My stomach started churning. So this is dirty money. Not illegal, but certainly ethically complex. Your grandfather believed that his fortune should be used to balance the scales, so to speak. The trust requires you to use the money for humanitarian purposes. Specifically, you must establish and fund charitable organizations focused on veterans' mental health, international disaster relief, and educational programs for underprivileged youth. I stared at him. You're telling me my grandfather, who cut off his own son for disagreeing with him, wants to turn me into some kind of philanthropist? William Blake was a complicated man, Mr. Blake. He spent his final years reflecting on his legacy. The trust is his attempt at redemption, both for himself and for the fortune he built on morally ambiguous ground. The lawyer reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a thick stack of documents. If you choose to accept the inheritance, you'll have access to the full $53 million. However, you'll be required to establish the charitable organizations within 6 months and begin dispersing funds within 1 year. You'll also be prohibited from using more than 10% of the total for personal expenses. $5 million for personal expenses. Even the scraps from this inheritance were more than I'd ever dreamed of having. What happens if I refuse? The money goes to the United States Treasury. Your grandfather was very specific about that. He believed that if his own family wouldn't take responsibility for his legacy, then the government should reclaim what it helped him earn. I looked around my shabby apartment, at the stack of bills on my coffee table, at the life I'd built from nothing and was barely managing to maintain. 3 days ago, my biggest worry had been whether I could afford to fix the transmission on my 15-year-old pickup truck. Now I was sitting across from a man in a $1,000 suit, talking about inheriting more money than some small countries had in their national budgets. I need time to think about this. Whitman nodded, standing smoothly and straightening his jacket. Of course. However, I should mention that the trust has a time limit. You have 30 days from today to make your decision. After that, the opportunity expires permanently. He left his business card on my coffee table next to the unpaid bills and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he turned back. Your grandfather included a personal letter with the trust documents. I wasn't instructed to deliver it unless you expressed interest in accepting the inheritance. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. What does it say? I don't know. It's sealed. But perhaps it might help you understand William Blake's motivations. After he left, I sat in my apartment staring at the business card until the letters started blurring together. $53 million. A grandfather I'd never known existed. A father who'd kept secrets until the grave. I picked up my phone to call Emma, then stopped. What would I even say? That our deadbeat dad had been the heir to a fortune and never told us? That the grandfather we'd never heard of had been some kind of defense contractor who'd made his money on government secrets? Outside my window, the city hummed with its usual Friday night energy. People heading to bars, restaurants, whatever entertainment they could afford after a long week of work. Normal people with normal problems, not sitting in studio apartments. Trying to process the kind of news that belonged in movies, not real life. I opened another beer and started reading through the documents Whitman had left. The legal language was dense enough to give me a headache, but the basic facts were clear. William Montgomery Blake had been exactly what Whitman claimed, a wealthy defense contractor with Pentagon connections and a complicated conscience. The trust documents outlined specific requirements for the charitable organizations I'd be required to establish, complete with detailed reporting requirements and oversight provisions. This wasn't just about receiving money. It was about taking responsibility for a legacy I'd never asked for, built on work I'd never understood, from a man I'd never met. My phone buzzed with a text from Eddie. Found some of your dad's stuff in my garage. You want it? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Yeah, I'll pick it up tomorrow. Maybe somewhere in Dad's belongings, I'd find some clue about the grandfather who'd shaped our lives from the shadows. Maybe I'd understand why he'd chosen to keep us in poverty rather than swallow his pride and reconcile with a father who'd clearly been capable of forgiveness, even if it had taken him decades to find it. Or maybe I'd just find more questions, more secrets. More evidence that the people we think we know best are often the ones hiding the most from us. Either way, I had 30 days to decide whether I wanted to inherit not just $53 million, but the moral weight of where that money had come from and what I was supposed to do with it. The clock was ticking. Eddie's garage was a monument to organized chaos. Car parts, fishing equipment, and decades of accumulated junk created a maze that somehow made perfect sense to him. He emerged from behind a vintage Camaro holding a cardboard box that looked like it had survived several floods. Found this stuff wedged behind my workbench, he said, setting it down on his cluttered tool table. Rick must have left it here during one of his binges. You know how he got when the demons were chasing him. I opened the box expecting the usual detritus of my father's life, unpaid bills, empty cigarette packs, maybe some photos from better times. Instead, I found something that made my hands shake. Military discharge papers. Not just any discharge papers, honorable discharge from the Army Corps of Engineers, dated 1989. According to the documents, Richard Blake had served with distinction for 2 years, specializing in demolitions and infrastructure assessment. There were commendations, performance reviews that painted a picture of a dedicated soldier with exceptional technical skills. Eddie, did you know my dad was in the military? Eddie's weathered face scrunched up in confusion. Rick? Army? Kid, your old man couldn't do 10 push-ups if his life depended on it. He was scared of firecrackers, let alone explosives. But there it was, in black and white. Service number, commanding officer signatures, even a photograph of a young Richard Blake in dress uniform, looking proud and confident in a way I'd never seen him. Beneath the military papers were college transcripts from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. My father, who I'd watched struggle to balance a checkbook, had apparently graduated magna cum laude with a degree in civil engineering. This can't be right, I muttered, but even as I said it, pieces of my childhood started rearranging themselves in my memory. Dad's uncanny ability to fix anything mechanical, the way he could look at a broken appliance and immediately know what was wrong. His obsession with building elaborate card houses that defied physics, structures so complex I'd thought he was just showing off. The last item in the box was a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was definitely my father's, but the words belonged to a stranger. March 15, 1987, had the meeting with the old man today. He wants me to join Blake Advanced Systems, start at the bottom and work my way up like he did. Says the military gave me good discipline, that I'm finally ready to be part of the family business. But I've seen the contracts, read the technical specifications. They're not building bridges or hospitals. They're building weapons designed to level cities, surveillance systems that would make Orwell weep. March 20, 1987, Sarah thinks I should take the job. Says we need the money if we're going to get married, start a family. She doesn't understand that some prices are too high to pay. The old man built his empire on suffering, and he wants me to be his heir apparent. Every dollar would be blood money. March 25, 1987, told him no today. Final answer. He said I was naive, that I'd come crawling back when reality hit. Told him I'd rather dig ditches than help build his war machine. The look in his eyes. I don't think he'll forgive this. Sarah's pregnant. Don't know how I'm going to provide for a family on pride alone. I sat down hard on Eddie's greasy shop stool, journal trembling in my hands. The father I'd known, the failed dreamer, the man who couldn't hold a job, had been a fiction. Richard Blake hadn't been unable to succeed, he'd chosen failure rather than compromise his principles. You find something good there? Eddie asked, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. Eddie, what do you know about my grandfather? My dad's father? The old man's expression darkened. That's a name Rick made me promise never to bring up. Said his father was dead to him, literally and figuratively. Why? I told him about Whitman's visit, about the trust, about William Montgomery Blake's $53 million attempt at posthumous redemption. Eddie listened without interruption, occasionally shaking his head. So the old bastard finally grew a conscience, he said when I finished. Too little, too late, if you ask me. Your dad spent 34 years paying for that man's pride. What do you mean? Eddie pulled 2 beers from a mini fridge that had seen better decades and handed me one. Rick was brilliant, Marcus. I mean scary smart. After he got cut off, he'd get job offers from engineering firms, defense contractors, tech companies. Good money, too. But every time he looked like he might accept, something would happen. The offers would mysteriously disappear, or the companies would suddenly find problems with his background check. My stomach dropped. You think my grandfather was sabotaging him? I don't think, I know. Rick told me about it during one of his darker nights. Said his father had made sure he'd never work in any field that mattered. William Blake had connections everywhere: Pentagon, major corporations, government agencies. One word from him could destroy a career before it started. The beer tasted like ash in my mouth. So Dad turned to construction work, sales jobs. Jobs that kept him away from anything technical, anything that might let him use his real skills. Your grandfather didn't just disinherit Rick financially, Marcus. He took away his purpose, his identity. Turned one of the smartest men I ever knew into a day laborer. I thought about all those years watching my father bounce between menial jobs, drinking away his frustration, gambling on long shots because legitimate success had been systematically denied to him. Every disappointment, every failure, every night I'd found him passed out on the couch, all of it traceable back to a grandfather who'd punished his son's conscience by destroying his future. Trust, I said quietly. It's not redemption. It's manipulation. One last way to control the family. Eddie nodded grimly. Sounds about right. A man like that doesn't change, even in death. He's just found a new way to play puppet master. I drove home through city streets that looked different now, like I was seeing them through someone else's eyes. Every billboard, every storefront, every person walking past carried the weight of questions I'd never thought to ask. How many other families had been shaped by secrets? How many children had grown up thinking their parents were failures when they were actually victims? Back in my apartment, I spread the journal entries across my coffee table like pieces of a puzzle. The picture they painted was devastating. My father hadn't been weak or lazy or incapable. He'd been systematically destroyed by a man who'd confused power with love, control with family loyalty. The sealed letter from William Blake sat unopened on my counter, taunting me. Part of me wanted to burn it without reading it, to reject everything connected to the man who'd caused so much pain. But another part, the part that had inherited more from my father than just his name, needed to be understood. I opened the envelope with surgical precision, as if the wrong movement might detonate whatever was inside. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by a man in his final days. Marcus, if you are reading this, then Richard is gone, and you have been presented with a choice I pray you make differently than your father did. I was wrong about many things in my life, but I was most wrong about my son. Richard saw clearly what I chose to ignore. The work we did, the contracts we fulfilled, the weapons we built, they were necessary evils in my mind, but evils nonetheless. Your father had the courage to walk away from wealth and comfort rather than compromise his principles. I had him blacklisted because I thought poverty would break his spirit, force him to return and beg forgiveness. Instead, I broke his life. The trust is not an attempt to buy forgiveness I don't deserve. It is an acknowledgement that the Blake fortune should be used to heal rather than harm. Richard tried to show me this path decades ago. I was too proud to listen then. Perhaps his son will have the wisdom I lacked. The money comes with conditions because wealth without purpose is destruction. I learned this too late. Use it better than I did. Honor the conscience your father passed to you. Be the man he raised you to be, not the man I tried to force him to become. William Montgomery Blake. I read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of regret and manipulation. Even in death, William Blake was trying to control the narrative, paint himself as a reformed villain seeking redemption through his grandson's actions, but between the lines, I saw something else. Fear. Fear that the Blake name would die with him. Fear that his fortune would disappear into government coffers with no one to remember William Montgomery Blake had ever existed. The trust wasn't about redemption, it was about legacy. He wanted to be remembered as the grandfather who saved his family's future, not the father who destroyed his son's life. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Unknown number. Marcus Blake speaking. Mr. Blake, this is Jennifer Morrison from Morrison Investigations. I specialize in family genealogy and background research. I understand you've recently learned about your grandfather's estate. The voice was professional, confident, with just a hint of urgency that set off alarm bells. Who told you that? I have connections in the legal community. Mr. Blake, there are things about your grandfather's business dealings that you need to know before you make any decisions about the trust. Things that Theodore Whitman may not have shared with you. Such as? Not over the phone. Can we meet? I have documents that will change your perspective on everything. I looked at the letter in my hands, at the journal entries scattered across my table, at the life I'd thought I understood crumbling around me like a house of cards in an earthquake. Where and when? Tomorrow, 2 p.m. There's a coffee shop called The Grind on 5th Street. Come alone, and Mr. Blake? Don't sign anything until we talk. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, trying to process this new development. How many people knew about the trust? How many were watching, waiting to see what choice I'd make? Outside my window, the city hummed with Saturday night energy. Somewhere out there, people were living normal lives with normal problems. Inside my apartment, I was holding $53 million worth of blood money and a dead man's attempt to rewrite history. 28 days left to decide. I poured myself a Real drink, whiskey this time, the kind my father used to buy when he wanted to forget, and tried to imagine what he would do in my situation. Take the money and honor his principles by using it for good? Or reject it entirely and let the government reclaim what William Blake had earned through moral compromise? The journal lay open to an entry dated just weeks before I was born. Sarah's due any day now. Been thinking about names. If it's a boy, I want to call him Marcus. Means warrior in Latin. Maybe he'll have the strength to fight battles I was too scared to face. Maybe he'll find a way to do what's right without sacrificing everything for it. I closed the journal and finished my drink. Tomorrow I'd meet with Jennifer Morrison and learn whatever secrets she thought I needed to know. Tonight, I'd try to understand the difference between the father I'd known and the man he'd really been, the warrior he'd hoped I might become. The Grind was the kind of coffee shop that tried too hard to be hipster, exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, and enough Edison bulbs to power a small city. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances. 20 years of watching my father navigate sketchy situations had taught me to always have an exit strategy. Jennifer Morrison wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of the stern investigator I'd imagined, a woman in her 40s approached my table with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. She wore a simple black blazer and carried a leather messenger bag that looked like it had seen serious use. Mr. Blake? She extended her hand with a firm grip. Thank you for meeting me on such short notice. Before we start, I said, not bothering with pleasantries, I need to know who's paying you and why you're interested in my family's business. She smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen since this whole mess started. Direct. I like that. The truth is, nobody's paying me for this conversation. I've been investigating Blake Advanced Systems for 3 years as part of a larger project on defense contractor corruption. Your grandfather's company was problematic. Morrison pulled a tablet from her bag and swiped to a document that made my coffee taste like acid. It was a government contract dated 1998, stamped with classifications I didn't recognize. The dollar amount had enough zeros to make me dizzy. Project Nightshade, she said quietly. Ever heard of it? I shook my head. It was a joint CIA-Pentagon operation designed to develop untraceable surveillance technology for use in American cities. The official story was counterterrorism. The reality was domestic espionage on a scale that would have made the East German Stasi jealous. She swiped to another document, technical specifications for something called urban monitoring arrays. The diagrams showed networks of cameras, microphones, and data collection points designed to track every movement, conversation, and transaction in major metropolitan areas. Your grandfather's company built the hardware. The beauty of Blake Advanced Systems was plausible deniability. Officially, they manufactured traffic management systems and urban infrastructure. Unofficially, they were creating the architecture for a surveillance state. My hands felt numb. How do you know all this? Because 5 years ago, someone leaked the Nightshade files to me. A whistleblower who'd worked inside Blake Advanced Systems and couldn't live with what they'd helped create. Morrison's expression darkened. That person was murdered 3 weeks after our first meeting. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too exposed. Murdered how? Car accident. Single vehicle collision on a lonely stretch of highway. Very convenient timing. She closed the tablet and leaned forward. Marcus, your grandfather didn't just build weapons. He helped create a surveillance infrastructure that's still operating today. Every major American city has Blake technology embedded in its infrastructure. Traffic cameras that do more than monitor traffic. Cell towers that capture more than phone calls. Urban sensors that track more than weather patterns. I thought about the letter William Blake had left me, his claims about seeking redemption and moral awakening. If this is true, why would he want to give me the money? Why not just let it go to the government? Because the government already has what it needs. The surveillance network is operational, self-sustaining, and virtually undetectable. They don't need William Blake's money anymore. But they definitely don't want that money funding organizations that might expose what he helped build. Morrison pulled out a manila folder thick enough to stop a bullet. This is everything I've gathered on Project Nightshade and Blake Advanced Systems. Financial records, technical specifications, correspondence between your grandfather and his government handlers. If you accept that trust money and start funding humanitarian organizations, you need to understand what you're really inheriting. I opened the folder and immediately wished I hadn't. The first document was a memo from William Blake to Pentagon officials, dated 2003, Phase 3 implementation proceeding ahead of schedule. Urban deployment in Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia now at 87% coverage. Subject tracking accuracy has improved to 94.3% reliability. Recommend expansion to secondary markets within 6 months. Subject tracking, I said, my voice barely a whisper. American citizens going about their daily lives, completely unaware they were test subjects in the largest domestic surveillance program in history. Morrison's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years uncovering horrors. Your grandfather didn't just profit from this, Marcus. He pioneered it. I flipped through more documents, each one revealing new layers of violation. Financial records showing payments disguised as infrastructure grants. Technical manuals for equipment that bore no resemblance to its official purpose. Correspondence discussing behavioral modification through environmental manipulation, using the surveillance data to subtly influence people's daily routines. There's more, Morrison said. Trust isn't just about charitable giving. Look at the specific requirements your grandfather included. She was right. Buried in the legal language Whitman had shown me were provisions I'd glossed over. The charitable organizations had to focus on veterans' mental health, disaster relief, and youth education, but they also had to operate in specific cities. Cities that happened to be the primary test sites for Project Nightshade. He wants you to put charitable organizations exactly where the surveillance networks are most concentrated, Morrison explained. Places where Blake technology is already embedded in the infrastructure. Your charities would be perfectly positioned to monitor the effectiveness of the systems he built. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Trust isn't redemption. It's a continuation. Your grandfather spent 40 years building a surveillance empire. The trust ensures that the empire has observers in place to document its effectiveness, while maintaining the appearance of humanitarian work. Morrison's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry, Marcus. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. I closed the folder, unable to process any more revelations. Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? I want you to understand what rejecting the trust would mean. If you turn down the inheritance, the money goes to the treasury, where it'll disappear into black budget projects that make Nightshade look like a child's toy. But if you accept it, I become part of the system. Not necessarily. Morrison reached into her bag and pulled out another document. There's a third option. Something your grandfather couldn't have anticipated because he never understood. The kind of man your father raised. The document was a legal brief titled, Charitable Trust Modification Through Judicial Review. Dense legal language outlined a process for challenging the terms of a trust inheritance, arguing that conditions requiring illegal or unethical activities could be modified or removed by court order. A legal challenge could take years, I said, after scanning the first few pages. But it would freeze the trust during litigation. The money couldn't go to the treasury, couldn't be used for new surveillance projects, and couldn't fund whatever William Blake really intended. Most importantly, it would expose everything. Court proceedings are public record. Morrison stood, leaving the folder and legal brief on the table. I have to leave now. People are watching me, just like they watched my source. But Marcus, you should know something about your father that might help you decide. I looked up at her, still reeling from everything I'd learned. Richard Blake wasn't just a whistleblower's nightmare because he walked away from the family business. He was dangerous because he understood the technology better than anyone. Those MIT transcripts you found? He specialized in network security and counter-surveillance. Your father could have dismantled everything William Blake built, if he'd chosen to. Why didn't he? Because exposing the surveillance network would have hurt innocent people whose lives depended on the infrastructure it was hidden within. Traffic systems, emergency services, urban utilities, your father couldn't tear down the surveillance state without potentially destroying the legitimate systems people needed to survive. Morrison's voice carried deep respect. He chose to sacrifice his own future rather than risk collateral damage to others. She headed for the door, then stopped. You have 26 days left to decide. But remember, Marcus, your grandfather designed the trust assuming you were weak, like he thought your father was. He never considered that you might have inherited Richard's principles along with his intelligence. After she left, I sat in the coffee shop for 2 hours, staring at documents that redefined everything I thought I knew about my family. The trust wasn't a gift, it was a trap. Accept it, and I'd become part of a surveillance apparatus that treated American citizens like lab rats. Reject it, and I'd be handing even more resources to the same system, but there was a third path. A way to honor my father's memory while potentially exposing the truth about what William Blake had really built. It would mean years of legal battles, personal risk, and the certainty that powerful people would want me to disappear like Morrison sourced. I thought about the journal entry where my father had hoped I'd be a warrior, someone who could fight battles he'd been too scared to face. Maybe he'd been preparing me for this moment without even knowing it. I gathered up the documents and headed home, my mind already racing through possibilities. The trust was designed to control me, but legal systems could be used to serve justice. William Blake had built his empire assuming his family would always choose the easy path. He'd never met his grandson. 26 days to turn a dead man's manipulation into a weapon for truth. The clock was still ticking, but now I was watching it with different eyes. The warrior was awakening. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could find about trust law, surveillance technology, and the legal precedents for challenging inheritance conditions. My laptop became a portal into a world I'd never imagined: federal court cases involving whistleblowers, technical papers on urban monitoring systems, and news articles about mysterious deaths of people who'd gotten too close to classified information. The deeper I dug, the more I understood why my father had chosen poverty over participation. Blake Advanced Systems hadn't just built surveillance equipment, they'd created the blueprint for systematic privacy violation on a national scale. Every traffic camera, every smart city sensor, every digital billboard in major American cities potentially contained William Blake's technology, but knowledge came with consequences. By Thursday morning, I'd noticed the same blue sedan parked across from my apartment building for 3 consecutive days. Different times, different drivers, but the same license plate. When I left for work, it followed at a discreet distance. When I returned home, it was already waiting. I called Jennifer Morrison from a payphone outside a busy shopping center, using techniques my father had taught me during his more paranoid periods, techniques I'd thought were just quirks of a man damaged by disappointment. They know we met, Morrison said without preamble. How closely are they watching you? Blue sedan, rotating surveillance teams. Very professional. I watched the parking lot while I talked, noting the woman in the coffee shop who'd been reading the same magazine page for 20 minutes. Jennifer, I need to ask you something. The legal challenge you mentioned, is it even possible? Theoretically, yes. But Marcus, you need to understand what you'd be up against. This isn't just about money or family secrets. Blake Advanced Systems had contracts worth billions of dollars. The surveillance networks your grandfather built are considered critical national infrastructure now. Exposing them would threaten some very powerful people. What if I found another way? Something that doesn't require years of court battles. The line went quiet for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, Morrison spoke, her voice carefully neutral. What are you thinking? My father was a demolitions expert. He understood infrastructure, how systems connect, where the weak points are. What if there was a way to disable the surveillance networks without destroying the legitimate infrastructure they're hidden within? That would be sabotage, federal crime, potential terrorism charges. They'd put you away forever. Only if they caught me. And only if I did it myself. I watched the blue sedan cruise slowly through the parking lot, its occupants scanning for my location. What if someone else did it? Someone with the technical knowledge and the motivation to act? Marcus, what you're suggesting, I'm not suggesting anything illegal over the phone. But I am saying that $53 million could buy a lot of legitimate cybersecurity research. Academic studies on urban infrastructure vulnerabilities. Theoretical papers on how surveillance systems might hypothetically be compromised. Morrison's laugh was sharp, almost bitter. You're talking about funding hackers. I'm talking about funding security researchers who might discover alarming vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. Researchers who would feel morally obligated to report their findings to appropriate authorities. The surveillance woman in the coffee shop was now staring directly at me. Time to move. I have to go. Can you get me contact information for cybersecurity experts who specialize in urban infrastructure? Marcus, this is incredibly dangerous. If they suspect what you're planning, they already suspect everything. The question is whether I'm going to spend my life running from the shadows or do something that matters. I hung up and walked quickly toward the shopping center's main entrance, using the crowd and multiple exits to lose my tail. 3 hours of counter-surveillance later, I was reasonably confident I'd made it home undetected. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Morrison's documents spread across every available surface, trying to understand the technical specifications of the surveillance systems. The complexity was staggering: networks within networks, redundant systems, fail-safes designed to prevent exactly the kind of interference I was contemplating, but complexity also meant vulnerability. Every connection point, every data transfer, every backup system represented a potential weakness. My father's engineering training echoed in my mind: the more sophisticated a system becomes, the more ways it can fail. A soft knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. Too soft to be law enforcement, too tentative to be surveillance. I checked the peephole and found Emma standing in the hallway, looking nervous and somehow smaller than I remembered. I hadn't seen my sister in 8 months. After our mother remarried and moved to Portland, Emma had built a life that didn't include the complicated baggage of our father's failures. She worked in marketing for a tech startup, lived in a condo our mother helped her buy, and generally pretended our family's dysfunction had never touched her. "Hey," she said when I opened the door. "I heard about Dad. I'm sorry I missed the funeral." "You didn't miss much. Just me, Eddie, and a pastor who couldn't pronounce his name right." I stepped aside to let her in, quickly gathering up the surveillance documents. "How did you find my address?" "Same way I always find you when I need to," I asked Eddie. Emma looked around my shabby apartment with the careful expression of someone trying not to judge. "Marcus, I heard some strange rumors." "Something? About Dad having wealthy relatives?" I studied my sister's face, trying to read her motivations. Emma had inherited our mother's ability to compartmentalize, to treat unpleasant realities as problems that could be solved through proper planning and positive thinking. The idea that our family might have hidden complexities would threaten the clean narrative she'd constructed about her origins. "Who told you that?" "A man came to my office yesterday. Said he was a lawyer, that there might be inheritance issues to discuss. He left his card." She pulled out a business card that made my blood freeze. "Theodore Whitman. Do you know him?" The fact that Whitman had approached Emma meant the situation was escalating beyond my control. Either he was trying to pressure me through family leverage, or someone else was applying pressure to him. "Emma, I need you to listen very carefully. Dad wasn't who we thought he was. Our grandfather wasn't who we thought he was. And there are people watching our family now who don't have our best interests in mind." Her expression shifted from concern to the kind of patronizing patience she'd perfected during Dad's worst periods. "Marcus, I know losing him has been hard. But, sit down." My tone was sharp enough to cut through her denial. "Look at this." I handed her one of Dad's journal entries, the one describing his MIT graduation and the job offer from Blake Advanced Systems. Emma read it twice, her marketing-trained composure cracking with each word. "This can't be real. Dad could barely hold a job at the hardware store. Because our grandfather made sure he couldn't hold any job that mattered. Dad was brilliant, Emma. He was also principled enough to walk away from a fortune rather than compromise his ethics." I gave her the abbreviated version: the trust, the surveillance networks, the choice between blood money and poverty. Emma listened with the focused intensity she usually reserved for client presentations, asking sharp questions that proved she'd inherited more of Dad's intelligence than either of us had realized. "So what are you going to do?" she asked when I finished. "I'm going to honor Dad's principles while finding a way to expose what William Blake really built." I met her eyes directly. "But that's going to put me in danger, Emma." "Which means it might put you in danger too." "How much danger?" I told her about Jennifer Morrison's source, about the surveillance teams, about the billions of dollars in government contracts that depended on keeping Blake's secrets buried. Emma's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "You're talking about taking on the federal government." "I'm talking about exposing illegal surveillance of American citizens. Dad could have done it decades ago, but he was too worried about collateral damage. Maybe it's time someone in this family was willing to accept some risk." Emma stood and walked to my window, looking out at the city lights that suddenly seemed more sinister. Every camera, every sensor, every digital connection potentially feeding data to systems our grandfather had helped create. "The lawyer who came to see me," she said quietly. "He wasn't just asking about inheritance. He was asking about you. Your habits, your friends, whether you seemed stable after Dad's death." The implications hit me like ice water. They're building a profile. Trying to predict what I'll do. Or they're laying the groundwork to discredit you if you become a problem. Emma turned back to face me. Marcus, I've spent 5 years trying to distance myself from this family's drama. But if what you're saying is true, you don't have to be involved. Actually, it's better if you're not. Maintain your distance, keep your life clean. If this goes wrong, you'll need to be untouchable. But Emma was shaking her head. You said Dad was worried about collateral damage. What if the real collateral damage is doing nothing? What if every day those surveillance systems operate, they're hurting people we'll never know about? I stared at my sister, seeing something I'd never noticed before. Beneath the corporate polish and carefully managed life Emma had inherited the same moral compass that had driven our father to sacrifice everything for principle. Are you saying you want to help? I'm saying that maybe it's time the Blake family stopped being victims of William Blake's legacy and started being agents of its destruction. Emma's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Besides, I work in tech marketing. I know how to make complicated information accessible to people who need to understand it. Outside, the blue sedan was back, parked under a streetlight like a predator that had given up on stealth. The watchers had become bold enough to let themselves be seen, which meant they'd moved from surveillance to intimidation. 22 days left to make a decision that would define not just my future, but potentially the privacy rights of millions of Americans who had no idea they were being watched. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't facing it alone. Emma might not have our father's engineering brilliance, but she had something equally valuable: the ability to translate complex truths into messages that could change minds. The war for the Blake legacy was about to begin. The meeting with Theodore Whitman was scheduled for day 29, one day before the trust deadline. I'd chosen the location, a busy restaurant downtown with multiple exits and enough ambient noise to defeat most surveillance equipment. Emma sat at a corner table, ostensibly working on her laptop while actually documenting everything for the media campaign we'd spent 3 weeks preparing. Whitman arrived precisely on time, but he wasn't alone. A woman in her 50s accompanied him, her expensive suit and predatory demeanor screaming federal agent. She didn't bother introducing herself, which told me everything I needed to know about who was really behind this meeting. Mr. Blake, Whitman began, his earlier courtesy replaced by barely concealed irritation. I trust you're prepared to sign the acceptance documents today. I pulled out a manila envelope thick enough to stop a small caliber bullet and placed it on the table between us. Actually, I have some documents of my own to share. The unnamed woman leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on the envelope like it might explode. What kind of documents? The kind that explain what Blake Advanced Systems really built, who paid for it, and how it's been used against American citizens for the past 25 years. I opened the envelope and spread out carefully selected pages from Morrison's research. Did you know that Project Nightshade collected audio recordings from over 3 million private conversations in Detroit alone? Or that the Chicago deployment included facial recognition software capable of tracking individual citizens across the entire metropolitan area? Whitman's face had gone ash gray. Where did you get this information? The same place I got the technical specifications for the traffic management systems that were actually behavioral monitoring arrays. The same place I learned about the mysterious accidents that happened to people who asked too many questions about Blake technology. The federal agent's hand moved subtly toward her jacket. I smiled and continued talking, louder now, making sure nearby tables could overhear fragments of our conversation. Of course, the most interesting document is the one describing how the trust fund was designed to place charitable organizations in strategic locations to monitor the effectiveness of the surveillance networks. Hard to claim you're seeking redemption when you're actually trying to perfect your spy apparatus. You're making very serious accusations, the woman said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that usually made people back down. I'm making factual statements based on documentary evidence. Evidence that's already been shared with investigative journalists at 4 major newspapers, 3 television networks, and a dozen cybersecurity research firms. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. Did you really think I was going to handle this alone? That was a bluff, but a good one. Emma and I had contacted journalists, but getting them to take the story seriously required more proof than we currently possessed. However, the opposition didn't know that, and their reactions were giving me valuable intelligence about their vulnerabilities. Whitman attempted to regain control of the conversation. Mr. Blake, I think you misunderstand the nature of the trust. Your grandfather was a patriot my grandfather was a war profiteer who built illegal surveillance systems and had my father blacklisted for refusing to participate. I pulled out Richard's military discharge papers and MIT transcripts. Did you know my father served his country honorably before your client destroyed his life? Did you know he graduated magna cum laude from one of the world's most prestigious engineering schools? The federal agent was now openly studying the other restaurant patrons, assessing potential threats. Her discomfort told me we were on the right track. The trust remains valid regardless of your opinions about family history, she said. You have until tomorrow to accept or the money reverts to the government. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. I pulled out the legal brief Morrison had given me, now annotated with 3 weeks of additional research. A trust with conditions requiring participation in illegal activities can be challenged in federal court. The challenge automatically freezes the trust assets during litigation, preventing them from reverting to the Treasury. Whitman's eyes widened. You can't prove the conditions are illegal. I don't have to prove it. I just have to demonstrate probable cause for investigation. Once federal judges start examining the evidence about Project Nightshade, Blake Advanced Systems, and the real purpose of the charitable organization requirements, the burden of proof shifts to you. I stood up, gathering my documents. I'll be filing the challenge tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The media briefing is scheduled for 11. By noon, every cybersecurity expert in the country will be looking for Blake technology in their city's infrastructure. The federal agent finally spoke directly to me. Mr. Blake, you're making a mistake that could have serious consequences for your health and safety. Emma looked up from her laptop, her expression innocent but her voice carrying clearly across. The restaurant. Did you just threaten my brother's life? In public? While I was recording our conversation for my blog about government surveillance overreach. The woman's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a shade of red that suggested imminent cardiac events. She stood abruptly, signaling to Whitman that the meeting was over. This isn't finished, she said, her voice low enough to avoid Emma's recording but clear enough for me to understand the implications. You're right, I replied. It's just beginning. After they left, Emma and I sat in the restaurant for another hour, ostensibly celebrating but actually making sure we weren't followed. The surveillance teams had become less subtle over the past week, which meant they were either confident enough to abandon stealth or desperate enough to prioritize intimidation over intelligence gathering. Do you think they bought the bluff? About the journalists? Emma asked, closing her laptop. Enough to buy us time. But we need to make it reality quickly. I checked my watch. Morrison's contact at the Washington Post is expecting our call in 2 hours. The cybersecurity researcher at MIT wants to see the technical specifications tomorrow morning. Emma smiled, the same sharp expression she'd inherited from our father. And the legal challenge? Gets filed regardless of whether the media picks up the story. Even if we lose, the court proceedings will be public record. Someone, somewhere, will eventually connect the dots. We walked home through city streets that looked different now that I understood what was really watching us. Every camera, every sensor, every digital device potentially connected to systems our grandfather had helped create. But knowledge was power, and power could be used to serve justice instead of control. The blue sedan followed us for 6 blocks before giving up. Either they'd decided we weren't worth the effort, or they were planning something that didn't require surveillance. Back in my apartment, I called Jennifer Morrison from a secure phone Emma had acquired through her tech industry contacts. How did it go? Morrison asked. They're scared. The federal agent made direct threats in a public place while being recorded. That's desperation behavior. Or they're confident enough in their power to stop caring about subtlety. Marcus, I've been getting inquiries about my research. People who claim to be academic colleagues but ask questions that suggest government training. Are you safe? For now. But if this goes public, if the Blake documents become part of federal court proceedings. Morrison's voice trailed off. There are powerful people who've built careers on the surveillance infrastructure your grandfather created. They won't give up without a fight. Then we'd better make sure we win. The next morning, I stood in the federal courthouse holding documents. That could expose one of the largest illegal surveillance operations in American history. Emma waited outside with journalists from 3 major news outlets, each of whom had spent the night reviewing evidence that painted a picture of systematic privacy violations spanning decades. At exactly 9 a.m., I filed the legal challenge to the Blake Family Trust. At 10 a.m., cybersecurity researchers at MIT, Stanford, and Carnegie Mellon received anonymous packages containing technical specifications for Blake Advanced Systems surveillance equipment. At 11 a.m., Emma held a press conference that would make the Blake name synonymous with government surveillance overreach. By noon, #BlakeFiles was trending on social media. By evening, congressional representatives were calling for investigations. By the end of the week, the first Blake surveillance nodes had been discovered embedded in traffic systems across 6 major cities. The $53 million remained frozen in legal limbo, exactly where I wanted it. William Blake's attempt to control his family's future from beyond the grave had become the mechanism for exposing his crimes against American privacy. 6 months later, I stood in the same cemetery where I'd buried my father, this time visiting a different grave. William Montgomery Blake's headstone was simple granite, with dates and a name but no epitaph. Someone had left flowers, probably Whitman, still hoping to salvage his client's reputation. Emma joined me, carrying a folder of newspaper clippings, documenting the ongoing investigation into Blake Advanced Systems and the systematic dismantling of Project Nightshade surveillance networks. "Do you think he knew?" she asked, looking down at our grandfather's grave. "When he designed the trust, do you think he understood that it might be used against him?" I thought about the letter William Blake had left me, his claims about seeking redemption while actually trying to perpetuate his surveillance empire. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. He just underestimated the people he was trying to manipulate. The legal challenge had evolved into a federal investigation that would take years to complete. The trust money remained frozen, and might eventually be distributed to victims of illegal surveillance. Blake Advanced Systems had been dissolved, its contracts terminated, its technology flagged for removal from urban infrastructure. Most importantly, Richard Blake's name had been cleared. News coverage of the case included his military service, his MIT education, and his principled refusal to participate in his father's surveillance empire. The man I'd thought was a failure had been revealed as a hero who'd sacrificed everything to protect the privacy rights of people he'd never met. "What now?" Emma asked as we walked back toward the cemetery entrance. "Now we honor Dad's memory by making sure this never happens again. We use what we've learned to help other families uncover the truth about relatives who might not have been who they seemed." Emma smiled. "The Blake family business?" "The Blake family business. But this time, we're in the truth-telling industry instead of the secret-keeping industry." As we drove away from the cemetery, I thought about the warrior my father had hoped I might become. He'd been right about one thing: I'd found the strength to fight battles he'd been too scared to face. But he'd been wrong about the cost. Sometimes the right choice doesn't require sacrificing everything. Sometimes it just requires the courage to use the weapons your enemies hand you. The trust had been William Blake's final attempt to control his family's future. Instead, it had become our tool for dismantling his legacy and honoring the principles he'd tried to destroy. $53 million had been frozen indefinitely, but the Blake family had finally inherited something more valuable than money: the truth about who we really were, and the power to decide who we wanted to become. The war for our grandfather's legacy was over. We'd won by refusing to fight it on his terms. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.